Hello, and welcome to Day 8 of Topher Reads The Hobbit. When we last left Bilbo, he was trying to escape from Gollum through the goblin tunnels. He had slipped his ring on to find out that when Gollum approached him, he had passed by without noticing him. So, let's pick up off where we left off. Yes. In a moment, Gollum was on him, but before Bilbo could do anything, recover his breath, pick himself up, or wave his sword, Gollum passed by, taking no notice of him, cursing and whispering as he ran. What could it mean? Gollum could see in the dark. Bilbo could see the light of his eyes palely shining even from behind. Painfully he got up and sheathed his sword, which was now glowing faintly again, and then very cautiously he followed. There seemed nothing else to do. It was no good crawling back down to Gollum's water. Perhaps if he followed him, Gollum might lead him to some way of escape without meaning to.
"Curse it! Curse it!" hissed Gollum. "Curse the Baggins! It's gone! What has it got in its pockets? Oh, we guess, my precious. He's found it. Yes, he must have my birthday present."
Bilbo pricked up his ears. He was at last beginning to guess himself. He hurried a little, getting as close as he dared behind Gollum, who was still going quickly, not looking back, but turning his head from side to side as Bilbo could see from the faint glimmer on the walls.
"My birthday present, curse it! How did we lose it, my precious? Yes, that's it. When we came this way last, when we twisted that nasty young squeaker. That's it, curse it! It slipped from us after all these ages and ages. It's gone, Gollum!"
Suddenly, Gollum sat down and began to weep, a whistling and gurgling sound horrible to listen to. Bilbo halted and flattened himself against the tunnel wall. After a while, Gollum stopped weeping and began to talk. He seemed to be having an argument with himself.
"It's no good going back there to search, no. We doesn't remember all the places we visited, and it's no use. The Baggins has got it in its pockets, the nasty noser has found it, we says. We guesses, precious, only guesses. We can't know till we find the nasty creature and squeezes it. But it doesn't know what the present can do, does it? It'll just keep it in its pockets. It doesn't know, and it can't go far. It's lost itself, the nasty, nosy thing. It doesn't know the way out. It said so." "It said so, yes, but it's tricksy. It doesn't say what it means. It doesn't say what it's got in its pockets. It knows a way in. It must know a way out. Yes, it's off to the back door. The back door, that's it." "The goblins will catch it, then it can't get out that way, precious." "Ah, goblins yes, but if it's got the present, our precious present, then goblins will get it. They'll find it, they'll find out what it does. We shan't ever be safe again, never, Gollum. One of the goblins will put it on, and then no one will see him. He'll be there, but not seen. Not even our clever eyes will notice him, and he'll come creepsy and tricksy and catch us, Gollum." "Then let's stop talking, precious, and make haste. If the Baggins has gone that way, we must go quick and see. Go, not far now. Make haste."
And with a spring, Gollum got up and started shambling off at a great pace. Bilbo hurried after him, still cautiously, though his chief fear was now of tripping on another snag and falling with a loud noise. His head was in a whirl of hope and wonder. It seemed that the ring he had was a magic ring. It made you invisible. He had heard of such things, of course, in the old tales, but it was hard to believe that he really had found one, and by accident. Still, there it was. Gollum with his bright eyes had passed him by only a yard to one side. On they went, Gollum flip-flapping ahead, hissing and cursing, Bilbo behind, going as softly as a hobbit can. Soon they came to places where, as Bilbo had noticed on the way down, side passages opened this way and that. Gollum began at once to count them.
1 left, yes. 1 right, yes. 2 right, yes, yes. 2 left, yes, yes.
And so on and so on. As the count grew, he slowed down, and he began to get shaky and weepy, for he was leaving the water further and further behind, and he was getting afraid. Goblins might be about, and he had lost his ring. At last he stopped by a low opening on their left as they went up.
7, yes. 6 left, yes,
he whispered.
This is it. This is the way to the back door, yes. Here's the passage.
He peered in and shrank back.
But we dursn't go in, precious. No, we dursn't. Goblins is down there. Lots of goblins is. We smell them. And what shall we do? Curse them and crush them. We must wait here, precious. Wait a bit and see.
So they came to a dead stop. Gollum had brought Bilbo to the way out after all, but Bilbo could not get in. And there was Gollum sitting humped upright in the opening, and his eyes gleamed cold in his head as he swayed it from side to side between his knees. Bilbo crept away from the wall more quietly than a mouse, but Gollum stiffened at once and sniffed, and his eyes went green. He hissed softly but menacingly. He could not see the hobbit, but now he was on the alert, and he had other senses that the darkness had sharpened. Hearing and smell. He seemed to be crouched right down with his flat hands splayed on the floor and his head thrust out nose almost to the stone. Though he was only a black shadow in the gleam of his own eyes, Bilbo could see or feel that he was tense as a bowstring gathered for a spring. Bilbo almost stopped breathing and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away out of this horrible darkness while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing, put its eyes out, and kill it. It meant to kill him. No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him, or tried to as of yet. And he was a miserable, lonely, and lost. A sudden understanding, a pity mixed with horror welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless, unmarked days without light or hope or betterment. Hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All these thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled. And then quite suddenly, in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leapt. It was no great leap for a man, but a leap in the dark. Straight over Gollum's head he jumped, 7 feet forward and 3 in the air, indeed. He had known it. He had only just missed cracking his skull on the low arch of the passage. Gollum threw himself backwards and grabbed as the hobbit flew over him, but he was too late. His hands snapped on thin air, and Bilbo, falling fair on his sturdy feet, sped off down the new tunnel. He did not turn to see what Gollum was doing. There was a hissing and cursing almost at his feet at first, and then it stopped. All at once there came a blood-curdling shriek filled with hatred and despair. Gollum was defeated. He dared go no further. He had lost his prey, and lost, too, the only thing he had ever cared for, his precious. The cry brought Bilbo's heart into his mouth, but still he held on. Now, faint as an echo, but menacing, the voice came from behind.
Thief! Thief! Baggins! We hates it! We hates it forever!
And then there was a silence, but that too seemed menacing to Bilbo. If goblins are so near that he smelled them, Then they'll have heard us shrieking and cursing. Careful now, or this way will lead you to worse things. The passage was low and roughly made. It was not too difficult for the hobbit, except when, in spite of all his care, he stubbed his poor toes again several times on nasty, jagged stones in the floor. A bit low for goblins, at least for the big ones, thought Bilbo. But Bilbo did not know that even the big ones, the orcs of the mountains, go along at a great speed, stooping low with their hands almost on the ground. Soon the passage that had been sloping down began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply. That slowed Bilbo down, but at last the slope stopped. The passage turned a corner and dipped down again, and there at the bottom of a short incline he saw, filtering round another corner, a glimpse of light. Not red light as of fire or from a lantern, but a pale, out-of-doors sort of light. And then Bilbo began to run. Scuttling as fast as his legs would carry him, he turned the last corner and came suddenly right into an open space where the light, after all that time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright. Really, it was only a leak of sunshine in through a doorway where a great door, a stone door, was left standing open. Bilbo blinked, and then suddenly he saw the goblins. Goblins in full armor, with swords drawn, sitting just inside the door and watching it with wide eyes and watching the passage that led to it. They were roused, alert, ready for anything. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him. Whether it was an accident or a last trick of the ring before it took a new master, the ring was not on his finger. And with yells of delight the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like an echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo, and forgetting even to draw his sword, he struck his hands into his pockets. And there was the ring still in his left pocket, and it slipped onto his finger. The goblins stopped short. They could not see a sign of him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud as before, but not so delightfully.
"Where is it?" "Go up the passage," some shouted. "This way," some yelled. "That way," the others yelled. "Look out for the door," bellowed the captain of the goblins. Whistles blew, armor clashed, swords rattled, goblins cursed and swore and ran hither and thither, falling over one another and getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry, to-do, and a disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but that he had the sense to understand what had happened and to sneak behind a big barrel, a barrel which held drink for the goblin guards, and so he got out of the way and avoided being bumped into, trampled to death, or caught by Feel. "I must get to the door, I must get to the door," he kept on saying to himself, but it was a long time before he ventured to try. And then it was like a horrible game of blind man's buff. The place was full of goblins running around, and the poor little hobbit dodged this way and that, and he was knocked over by a goblin who could not make it out what he had bumped into, and he scrambled away on all fours, slipped between the legs of the captain just in time, got up, and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed it nearly to. Bilbo struggled, but he could not move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed and squeezed. And he stuck. It was awful. His buttons had gotten wedged on the edge of the door and the door post. He could see outside into the open air. There were a few steps running down into a narrow valley between tall mountains. The sun came out from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door, but he could not get through. Suddenly one of the goblins inside shouted, "There is a shadow by the door! Something is outside!" Bilbo's heart jumped into his mouth. He gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through, with a torn coat and a waistcoat, leaping down the steps like a goat, while bewildered goblins were still picking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course, they soon came down after him, hooting and hallooing, and hunting among the trees. But they don't like the sun. It makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy.
They could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of the shadow of the trees, running quick and quiet and keeping out of the sun, so soon they went back grumbling and cursing to guard the door. Bilbo had escaped. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on till the sun began to sink westwards behind the mountains. The shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back, and then he looked forward and could see before him only ridges and slopes falling towards lowlands and plains glimpsed occasionally between the trees. Good heavens! I seem to have got right to the other side of the misty mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where and oh where Gandalf and the dwarves got to. I only hope to goodness that they are not still back there in the power of the goblins. He still wandered on out of the little high valley, over its edge and down the slopes beyond, but all the while a very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether he thought not, now he had the magic ring, if he should go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back, and very miserable he had felt about it, when he suddenly heard voices. He stopped and listened. It did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path winding downwards with a rocky wall on the left hand. On the other side the ground sloped away, and there were dells below the level of the path, overhung with bushes and low trees. In one of these dells under the bushes people were talking. Still he crept nearer, and suddenly he saw appearing between two big boulders a head with a red hood on it. It was Balin, doing lookout. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He had still got the ring on for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, and he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. I will give them all a surprise, he thought as he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels and wondering and debating what they were going to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could not possibly go on with their journey, leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of the goblins, at least without trying to find out if he was alive or dead, and without trying to rescue him.
After all, he is my friend, said the wizard, and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him.
The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought at all, and why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. He has been more trouble than you so far. If we had got to go back now into those abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say.
Gandalf answered angrily, I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you help me to look for him, or I go and I leave you here to get out of this mess the best that you can yourselves. If we can only find him again, you will thank me before all is over. Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory?
You would have dropped him, said Dory, if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripped up your feet, and kicked you in the back.
Then why didn't you pick him up again?
Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and Thorin was stabbing here and there everywhere with Orcrist. All of a sudden you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw all the goblins running back yelping. You shouted, "Follow me, everybody!" and everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, as you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards out of the lower door and helter-skelter down here. And here we are, without the burglar, confusticate him. And here's the burglar, said Bilbo, stepping down into the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped. And then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. He called to Balin, who told him what he thought of a lookout man who let people walk right into them like that without a warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted it no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled and sighed and said nothing whatever about the ring, and when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, very carefully and quietly." "Well, it is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted," said Balin, "and then I take my hood off to you." Which he did. Balin, at your service. "Your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. And then they wanted to know all about his adventures after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything, except about finding the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition and shuddered most appreciatively at his description of Gollum. "And then I couldn't think of any other question with him sitting beside me, so I said, 'What's in my pocket?' And he couldn't guess in 3 goes, so I said, 'What about your promise? Show me the way out.' But he came at me to kill me, and I ran, and I fell over, and he missed me in the dark. And then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, and so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him and escaped, and I ran down to the gate." "What about the guards?" they asked. "Weren't there any?" "Oh, yes, lots of them. But I dodged them. I got stuck in the door, which was only open a crack, and I lost lots of buttons." And he said it sadly, looking at his torn clothes. "But I squeezed through all right, and here I am." The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect when he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through a gate, as if it was not very difficult or very alarming.
"What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess."
He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his bushy eyebrows as he said this, and the hobbit wondered if he guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. See you all again tomorrow for
Out of the frying pan and into the fire.